brushes. Okay, which of these are you going to use for your watercolour painting? Now that's a bit better, isn't it? That's a bit more manageable, especially if you're just starting in watercolour. You see, most people buy a whole series of brushes over the years that they convince themselves they need at the time, and what happens, and I'm certainly no different, is that you come back to the same favourite 4 or 5 brushes that have served you well, painting after painting after painting. Let's just look at these 4 main types. There's all sorts of variants you can get from these, but this one, first of all, is probably the most common watercolour brush, which is the round brush, and that works on a numbering system. This is a number 10, and quite simply, the bigger the number, the bigger the brush. That's a natural hair, that is sable, that is the best quality you can get in watercolour brushes. But if that's beyond your pocket, then there are very many nylon or other synthetic hair equivalents that are very much cheaper and give you an easy introduction to a round brush. This one is known as a mop brush, and I'll show you what that does a little later on. You can see that's a wooden handle with some wire wrapped around it. That again is a natural hair, and we'll have a look at that shortly. This one is a flat brush, a 1-inch flat brush, which you can get in various sizes and various widths. That's a nylon hair, and again is not too dear, but is a very useful painting instrument. And this little fellow is a rigger, and you can see it's a long series of thin hairs that, when it's full of paint, can draw out very fine lines. In fact, its original purpose was to draw rigging on ships, on sailing ships, which is where it got its name from. That's again a nylon hair, and a very useful little tool it is. Right, now there's an odd 1 or 2 brushes I use. I have a couple of other brushes that are a slightly smaller version of this one, and a smaller flat brush. If you can get used to a very small number of brushes and how they work for you, I promise you your painting will come on in leaps and bounds far quicker than if you have a whole array of brushes and you don't know which one to pick up next. Right, well, I just want to quickly show you the standard setup that I use when I'm painting for myself. Here we've got an ordinary dining room table, which is actually circular, so it's not ideal, but it does prove that you don't need a full studio to get into watercolour painting. And what I'm using here is the paper stretcher that I showed you earlier, but I'm using it this time as a drawing board. I've got my paper taped with masking tape to the drawing board. I've also got my piece of paper towel. I've got a small offcut of watercolour paper taped here, and as you can see, I can use that to test out the strength of colours, and I'll come on to that in a moment because that's important. I've also got a piece of 2x2 wood, because what I'm going to do is just raise the easel to a comfortable height, and that is easier to paint on, and it also means when you put washes on, they'll start to roll gently down the paper and help you manipulate the paint. Right, now before we go any further, one of the biggest problems that newcomers to watercolours have is assessing the strength of the paint when they put it on the paper, as opposed to how it dries a few minutes later. Just let's get this masking tape off. There we are. It's run a little bit, but it doesn't matter. As you can see, wet paint that I've just put on that looks good, looks the right colour. But you can see what happens when it dries. It dries very, very pale. In fact, watercolour paint dries about 50% lighter than when it first goes on the paper. To achieve this dry colour here, I've used this strength of paint, and you can see how much stronger that is than that. That looks about the same strength as that when it goes on wet, but you can see how much lighter it's gone. So if you want to achieve this colour, you've got to quickly realise that your watercolours have got to go on quite strong, and that's even more important when you're putting blue into the top of a watercolour sky where you've previously wetted the paper to create soft cloud effects, because the water in the paper will dilute this colour down even more than it is already. Right, we're just going to have a quick look at the basic brush strokes that all of these brushes make. Now we'll look at variants of the brush strokes as we go through the tutorials, and where there's any special technique or mark that we need to make, I'll show you exactly how to hold the brush to achieve that as and when we come to it. But for now, this is a number 10 round brush, and basically if you press on harder like that, it goes a bit thicker, and then as you ease off it goes thinner again, and it's capable of producing a very nice series of variety of lines in the same brush stroke like that. But it can also produce quite a fine line like that if you want, or if you wanted to use the belly of the brush by scraping side to side, you can get that sort of more random hit and miss effect. But we'll look at that in more detail later on, particularly when we do the monochrome tutorial a little later. There's the round brush. Next up we've got the wash brush, or the mop brush, and as its name implies, mop and wash holds a heck of a lot of water or watery paint, and in fact I'm just going to wipe that because it's living up to its name at the moment, and unless I put some of this paint on the paper fairly quick, it's going to run down the handle all over my hand. So this is the wash or the mop brush, and you can see it's a very loose, random effect that's ideal, absolutely ideal for skies and the like, and it can also, when you want it to, produce quite a fine line like that. There we go, the mop brush. Next up we've got the flat brush, and as you can see, as I've said before, I've mentioned earlier, it's got this nice chisel edge, particularly with the nylon hair, that comes to that very fine edge. I'll try and do this like that, there we go. So you can produce a nice semblance of a yacht's mast if you wanted to, or if you want you can create very easily create square blocks. So there's a representation of a window or a doorway, whatever you want it to be. So there's the 1-inch flat brush, and with all of these brushes you'll find that you can get them in a variety of sizes, and eventually you'll probably want a couple of sizes of the flat brush as you will of the round brush. And then finally we have the rigger with the long thin hairs, originally developed, as I've said earlier, for painting ships rigging. It really is capable of producing a very fine line, in fact so fine you probably need just about be able to see that. But it can also produce other effects as well, using you can see it's using the texture of the surface of the paper to give nice effects, and that's a very useful little painting tool to have in your armoury, the rigger.